In all this, you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that your faith, greater worth than gold, which perishes even through refining by fire, may be proved genuine and may result in praise, glory, honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. Though you have not seen him, you love him. And even though you do not see him now, you believe in him and are filled with an inexpressible and glorious joy, for you are receiving the end result of your faith, the salvation of your souls. Now that is incredibly heavy. That is just so full of heaviness that is actually quite difficult to read out. So let me just unpack this slightly. So like I said earlier, obviously this is written by Peter. He's writing this to a couple of churches, which is probably known now as modern Turkey. And he's writing to them at a time when they are obviously going through lots of trials, suffering and persecution for their faith. So this is written at maybe about 20 years after the resurrection. So just to recap on who Peter is a little bit. So Peter was the first kind of following that Jesus chose. He bumped into Peter when Peter was fishing, etc. And Peter followed him. And Peter's also the character who betrayed Jesus 3 times. So Peter and Jesus, through Jesus' time on earth, were quite close. They were very close friends. And even though they were very close, Peter did betray him. So as the story goes along, when we hit 1 Peter, Peter at that point has become a missionary, he's become a leader, and he is championing the cause. So Peter's got a very much a pastoral heart, and he writes to this collection of churches to encourage them. Now the interesting thing is he wants to give them hope. He wants to encourage them. And what does he turn to? It's written clearly there. The first thing that he wants to highlight is the resurrection, which almost seems to indicate that as soon as our hearts or our minds are troubled, according to Peter, it makes total sense to turn to the resurrection. When we turn to 1 Peter 3, it says here, "Praise be to God and the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead." So he's clearly pointing at the resurrection. And the thing that he's highlighting there, that if you focus on the resurrection, you cannot help but experience a rebirth. We've all heard the term being born again, and that's what he's referring to here. When you focus on the resurrection and you stare at it and you sit with the magnitude of what that means, you will experience a rebirth. When you look at the Gospels, it's just really fascinating to think that none of the disciples really predicted that this was going to happen. When you look at the way they write, they did not expect that they were going to experience Jesus dying and then resurrecting. It's just so fascinating that this launched, particularly Peter, in totally different worldview. He had to totally reevaluate how he saw God's plans, and then set out totally to share that news, to share that resurrection story. For us, we talk about the resurrection, particularly at Easter time, don't we? But for these people, the early Christians, they talked about it constantly. It was the thing that encouraged them, the thing that so blew them away that they saw their Saviour being crucified. They witnessed all the torment of that, and then him being resurrected from the dead. So for us, if we experience this resurrection, if we sit with this resurrection, we will be transformed. We will experience a rebirth experience. When we read on, Peter uses the analogy of an inheritance. He talks about us inheriting, hang on, let me just read this, and into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil or fade. So he's talking about this living hope that we will inherit. One day when Jesus returns, when there will be a new order, we will inherit an inheritance. It's not going to be, a pile of money or a lump of gold. It is a hope of a new life, a new order, a new body, a new relationship with people around us, and a relationship with God. So that's something that we've got an incredible hope for. Hope is fundamental to our psychology. Would we agree with that? Hope is something that keeps us going. When we take away hope from somebody, there's very little left that will sustain them. I've read a book by Viktor Frankl. Anyone familiar with Viktor Frankl? Great, just one or two of you. Anyway, he's a psychologist who went through the Holocaust, and he ended up in the concentration camp. And he could not help but analyze how different people responded to their situation. And just to kind of simplify things here, he kind of categorized them into three types. One type of persons would adopt the same kind of monster kind of attitude. They were looking out for themselves, and they adopted kind of like an animal kind of behavior. Another category of people, they ignored the reality of what they were experiencing. They believed that one day, the war would end and they would be back to where they were and back with their family, and nothing particularly would change. And then the third category of people, which Victor was one of them, people attached themselves to a hope. Maybe a hope that one day they would play an instrument again, or a hope that one day they would bake a piece of bread again, or for Victor that he would practice as a psychotherapist again. Now, having a hope for him was just incredible, considering the conditions that they were in. Hope is fundamental to us sustaining our life here on earth. And when we read on, this becomes clearer. So as it reads on, the inheritance is kept in heaven for you, who through faith are shielded by God's power until the coming of salvation that is ready to be revealed in the last time. In all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. Now we can all relate to that, can't we? We can all relate to experiencing all kinds of trials. Nobody in this room is without their trials. When you think about Jesus' trial, they were really concentrated, weren't they? When he was in Gethsemane, he wasn't particularly rejoicing, was he? He was really suffering, wasn't he? It was really concentrated for him. For people who went through the war or went through the Holocaust, again, it was really concentrated. What they had to experience, what they had to let go of, their sense of identity, they lost loved ones, their careers, or they were in a real season of loss and pain. And I don't know if you've realized this already, and I don't want to be too gloomy here, but we're all on that kind of journey, aren't we? Some of us more acutely than others. We all have loved ones that we don't want to lose. We all have bodies that we don't want to give way. We all have a life that we have to kind of let go of. And that is really challenging. And it talks here about that we have to endure these things. And the experience of that will bring about gold. As we experience this fire of life, because pain and loss, they're incredible teachers, aren't they? When you talk to people who have lived for a while and have experienced loss, you recognize that wisdom. You recognize that insight that they have gained through those losses, through that journey. And we are all going to experience that wisdom building in us if we allow it to. So what do we do with all that? What do we do with that journey? Like I've already said, we have got a living hope. We've got a living hope in Jesus. Jesus endured what we're all enduring. He chose to identify himself with us so that we could identify with him. And I just find it remarkable when you think about when Jesus was on earth, he was so misunderstood. I mean, who struggles with being misunderstood here in this room? When I get misunderstood, I find that really difficult when somebody makes a conclusion that is not the conclusion I wanted them to reach. And it can be quite painful, can't it? Now, if you think of Jesus, the people that were closest to him, people like Peter, his disciples, they most of the time misunderstood what he was about, what he was going to endure. When he was facing all those trials by all those different people in authority, they didn't recognize who he truly was. They didn't understand. They didn't see. When you think about the story we heard earlier about the Emmaus walk, they didn't recognize him. They didn't see who he was. If you think about the critics who were standing at the cross, shouting out, "Go on then, Jesus, why don't you get down from the cross and prove to everybody that you're God?" They didn't see who he really was and what he was trying to achieve. Now, what I find incredibly interesting when you think about this, in a way, Jesus is still on trial today. He's on trial in our minds and in our hearts. Who do we say as individuals? Who do I say as me who Jesus is? In a way, he's still on trial today. And I really fundamentally believe that our relationship with Jesus is dynamic. You don't experience him one time and then you've got it. You've understood and you've captured who Jesus is. It takes time. It takes a relationship to gain understanding at the magnitude of what Jesus has done for us as individuals and has done for mankind. When Jesus walked out that tomb, something incredible happened for mankind, for the universe. It was never going to be the same again. So I can totally relate to those disciples walking to Emmaus. You know, I must admit, at times, I'm not quite sure who Jesus is. And it wasn't until the interesting part of that story of those two disciples walking to Emmaus is that their eyes didn't open until they ate the bread and the wine, until they broke bread and drank the wine. Their eyes were opened. And I think that's really interesting when you think about, so what actually happens then? What actually happens in the journey of our relationship with Jesus? Well, I suggest that it's something that we have to constantly attend to. It is something that we have to visit. It is something that we have to spend time with. So it's just remarkable when you think about when Jesus knew he was going to be betrayed, that he knew that something that would keep us in touch with him would be the breaking of the bread and drinking of the wine. Because in those moments, we are remembering, aren't we? We are remembering what happened when Jesus chose to identify with us and take on our predicament, our humanity's predicament, our selfishness, our brokenness. He took that upon himself and chose to die, chose to endure all those trials, chose to endure, being flogged, being hung on the cross. He chose to withhold all that power he had available to him and chose to lay in a tomb and show us that he had power over death. I mean, can you imagine if there had been no resurrection, if that's where it had ended? What would that mean for you? I suggest that we take communion regularly and we stare at Jesus' face. We get captivated by what he's offering us and look into the resurrection. Look into the resurrection, what that means for you personally. One day you will experience a resurrection yourself. Have you thought about that? No, Paul? No. It's really difficult to contemplate, isn't it? It's challenging the mystery of what has been given to us to try and give it shape. There are still a lot of unknowns, and we have to sit in that place and be comfortable with that and to be okay with those questions. But it's been clearly laid out to us what we can understand and what we have been given. So we have gotten an incredible living hope in Jesus. So why don't we move into communion? It's a good prompt. And as you take it, can I encourage you, like I said a moment ago, maybe to put all the things aside that we do, the things that are good and the things that are not so good. Maybe even put aside how you've conceptualized who Jesus is. Put that to the side and try and re-identify with what Jesus has given you, what he is offering to us, the living hope, the unchanging hope. We will change. We are transformed as we go on. We'll bring communion round and there'll be a song playing and with some lyrics that you can look at. So we'll do that now and then we'll have some prayer and then we'll have some worship time.